The French Revolution was an era of social, political, economic, and religious change. It entailed the upheaval of an entire society, completely changing the way the world viewed leadership and social constructs. For the first time in European history, people believed that everything about a country could be changed, from its social classes to its monarchy and religious structure. It introduced social change into all of Europe as its ideas of equality and reason spread across the continent.
French Revolution is this extraordinary moment when people began to believe that you could actually recreate almost everything in a society, that you could not only change the politics, the institutions, but you could change human nature itself through political action.
The years leading up to the French Revolution were filled with poor economic policy, unbalanced social classes, irresponsible spending, population growth, and bad harvests. Throughout the 1700s, France fought many costly wars, and their people suffered because of it. These included the War of Spanish Succession, the War of Austrian Succession, the Carnatic Wars, the 7 Years' War, and the American Revolutionary War. On top of the cost of each war, Louis XV, after his humiliating loss of the 7 Years' War, was determined to rebuild with a larger navy and coalition of allies, only amounting to greater debt. French support of the American Revolution under the rule of Louis XVI was also very expensive, costing about 2 billion French livres. This led to a worsening economic crisis, pushing the country towards bankruptcy and angering the people. Louis XVI, who ruled from 1754 to 1793, made some attempts at economic reform. He deregulated the grain market in hopes that the cost would lower with less government intervention. However, this only caused prices to increase. He then appointed a finance minister, Jacques Necker, who pushed tax reforms and published the monarchy's finances, making him a popular figure among the people. However, the financial solutions proposed by Necker were all effectively shot down. Instead of a parliament, the French government of the time had an appellate court, which consisted of appointed judges, all of whom were nobles. The court had the power to veto major laws passed by the monarchy in an attempt to balance the power. Since Necker's reforms included taxation of the rich, every single one was vetoed by the court. Louis XVI's advisors and fellow nobles heavily opposed Necker and his ideas. Louis XVI himself was also unable to create effective economic policy.
It was very hard for Louis to come to decisions. He dithered incessantly. He was always ready to be persuaded by the last person he had talked to. Again, those are usually not considered good leadership qualities.
Due to these qualities, he was easily persuaded against tax reforms, firing Necker and continuing the monarchy's reputation of indecisive and ineffective economic policy. The economic crisis was furthered by the estate system, an unbalanced class system that determined the rights and privileges of people based on birth. Before the Revolution, French society was broken into 3 estates: the First Estate, the Second Estate, and the Third Estate. This system, called the Ancien Regime, dominated French society since the early Middle Ages. The First Estate consisted of the Roman Catholic clergy members. They owned about 10% of the land, but only made up about 0.05% of the population. In addition to owning more than their fair share of land, they received other special privileges, such as the ability to collect tithes from all members of the church, which was nearly everyone living in France. Protestant and Jewish people living in France were actually denied official membership of the state, granting them less rights than even the lowest class members of society. Tithes were a mandatory religious contribution equaling 10% of each member's annual income or produce. This amassed a massive amount of revenue for the church. Their revenue for the year 1789 was an estimated 150 million livres. The clergy claimed to use the money from tithes to improve the church and benefit its members. However, the money was often misused by the clergy for personal, luxurious, and unnecessary purposes. This included building unnecessarily large and extravagant churches filled with expensive decorations that cost millions to maintain. Val de Grace and Notre Dame are just 2 of these cathedrals, both located in Paris. The upper clergy members, such as the cardinals and archbishops, also used the money for personal reasons, such as parties and feasts among the upper estates. This was just one of many reasons the people were unsatisfied with the First Estate. With the continual wars France faced in the 1700s, people were also angry that all members of the First Estate were exempt from military service. The people had begun to question why they were forced to work and contribute to society, while many members of the First Estate were not, causing tension between the people and the church. There was also tension between lower and upper ranks of the church. While all ranks of the clergy belonged to the First Estate, the lower ranks often did not benefit from privileges as the upper ranks did. The parish priests, in particular, were discontent with the upper ranks. These well-educated, hard-working, and compassionate priests made up about 1/3 of the clergy, but were often disregarded and paid poorly by the upper ranks. The continued tension and discontent from the people and the lower ranks led to the questioning of the First Estate's authority and power. The Second Estate consisted of the French nobility. They made up about 1.5% of the population, but owned about 25% of land. The nobility, similar to the First Estate, were allowed to collect dues from peasants living on their land. This system is known as feudalism, where peasants were allowed to live on the land and provided with military protection. In exchange, they pay their landowners a percentage of their profits or produce. While feudalism was not as widespread in France as other European countries of the time, it was still a heavily abused system. The Second Estate landowners often charged ridiculous dues, creating debts for peasants and making it impossible to move away or become landowners themselves. This economic abuse by the clergy and nobility made the life of peasants in France very difficult. The final estate is the Third Estate, which 98% of the population belonged to. This consisted of all commoners, including peasants, but also merchants, lawyers, laborers, and basically everyone that was not a clergy member or a noble. The only people who did not belong to any estate were those who were not members of the Catholic Church. The Third Estate was allowed very little, if any, involvement in the government. All important government, military, and church positions were held by members of the First and Second Estate. On top of having all government control, the First and Second Estates were exempt from nearly all taxes, which created the extreme economic crisis France was facing, as well as the discontent of the people. The financial burden of the entire country was placed on the poorest class, the Third Estate. They also had no involvement in the government that was taxing them. As the ideas of the American Revolution spread to France, the Third Estate was angry, as they were also being taxed without representation in government. When concerns of the Third Estate were brought to King Louis XVI, they were ignored. The reasoning behind ignoring the people was the divine rights of kings, which stated that the king was chosen by God as his messenger. Thus, he did not need to communicate with the people, as God was guiding him well. Although King Louis XVI himself admitted that he was unsure.
The 20-year-old king prays, "Protect us, Lord, for we reign too young."
In the face of crisis, Louis XVI was an ineffective leader who often hid behind the divine rights theory. The spread of Enlightenment ideas by philosophers such as John Locke refuted the divine rights theory, causing the general public to question the authority of the monarchy and the king's neglect of their concerns. Enlightenment ideas also caused the public to question the authority of the First Estate and the Church, especially debating their right to collect tithes. At this point, the Third Estate was losing trust and faith in the upper estates, fueled by the Age of Enlightenment and ideas of change.
In old regime Europe, you were told what to think. You were given information from above by your rulers, by your priests. And so the idea that you could map out all of human knowledge and then have access to it was revolutionary.
This idea was one of many from the Enlightenment that challenged the upper estates. This mistrust and discontent was compounded as the government, in an attempt to pay their debt created by wars, raised taxes again and again, making it increasingly difficult for commoners to survive. These struggles were furthered by a decade of extreme winters and poor harvests.
With the economy in ruins and the people restless, it seems as if even the heavens are angry, smiting France with the most bitterly cold winter in 90 years.
If ever God intervened to make a situation worse, the summer of 1788 and the spring of 1789 is a moment when that happens. By the summer of 1788, you already have a burgeoning political crisis, and it's developing against a background of very serious food shortage.
The price of flour, now that less was being produced, increased exponentially. This had a huge impact on the Third Estate, as their main source of food was bread. It is estimated that the average French commoner of the time spent about 90% of their income on bread alone. Furthermore, the population of France was on the rise, with an increase of 6 million people from 1720 to 1790. This is because many people, by this point, had developed immunities to the Black Plague, so it had mostly faded. Less people were dying to disease, but the birth rate remained the same, drastically increasing the population. There were more mouths to feed and less food to do so, causing a lot of anxiety and anger among the people.
Complaints are committed to paper. One charge is leveled directly at the royal court.
Do you know why there are so many needy people? It is because your luxurious existence devours in one day the substance of 1,000 men.
This became the main fuel for the French Revolution.
Sparse food supplies are hoarded. The cost of a loaf of bread soon equals a month's earnings. Hunger turns to rage. Riots break out across France. Homes are robbed. Bakeries are raided. And shopkeepers suspected of stockpiling bread are lynched on the spot.
While the people suffered and starved, they saw the upper estates living luxuriously, furthering their anger. The construction and remodeling of the Palace of Versailles throughout the 17th and 18th centuries cost millions of French livres in tax collections paid by the Third Estate. Both Louis XV and Louis XVI, along with his wife, Marie Antoinette, hosted lavish dinner parties and feasts with expensive and imported delicacies. The monarchs also bought expensive clothing, shoes, and jewelry, all paid for with tax money, despite the economic crisis around them. Marie Antoinette spent thousands alone on her wigs and extreme hairstyles.
While Louis sends money and troops across the Atlantic, Marie is busy incurring debts of her own. Life at Versailles is a never-ending routine of archaic ritual and formality. There are ceremonies for the waking of the king and queen, for dressing, for dining, for retiring to bed. To keep herself amused amidst the ritual drudgery, Marie Antoinette presides over a parade of increasingly outrageous fashions.
Marie was obsessed with fashion, especially these towering hairdos that were several feet high, that took hours and hours in the construction, and fit all sorts of ornaments and fruits, and to many people they seemed like an obscenity. They came to represent what was all that was wrong with her and with Versailles and that culture.
Marie occupies herself with court gossip, gambling, and the staging of plays. As her expenses accumulate, Marie earns the nickname Madame Deficit.
The people of the Third Estate, 98% of the population, were angry. Their leaders, their king, their queen, their upper clergy members, lived unnecessarily luxurious lives while they starved. Each of these factors, lavish spending, expensive wars, unbalanced social classes, and food shortage, stemmed from deep-rooted social and economic issues causing the French Revolution.
Not only were the royal coffers exhausted, but bad harvests, drought, livestock sickness, and increasing bread costs had sparked discontent among peasants and the urban poor over the previous 2 decades. By rioting, looting, and striking, many people voiced their despair and fury towards a dictatorship that imposed high taxes but failed to give any relief. Charles Alexander de Calonne, Louis XVI's Controller General, presented a financial reform package in the fall of 1786. This included a uniform land tax from which the favored classes would no longer be exempt. The French Revolution took place from May 5, 1789 to November 9, 1799. In 1789, on January 24th, King Louis summoned the Estates General. On June 20th, the Tennis-Court Oath took place. On this day, the Third Estate became the National Assembly and protested on the tennis court of the Estate General building after a failed attempt to take it over. On July 14th, the storming of the Bastille happened. King Louis XVI tried to take back absolute power by building up ammunition and supplies. However, on July 14th, a Parisian mob stormed the Bastille and an ammunition depot, defeating his attempt. On August 4th, abolition of feudal, noble, and clerical rights occurred. The abolition of feudalism was crucial to the evolution of a modern contractual notion of property and to the development of a market in land. On August 26th, the Declaration of the Rights of Man happened.
The Declaration of the Rights of Man was a declaration promulgated by the National Assembly, which said in its text that the sovereignty belongs to the people, belongs to the nation. The king is nowhere mentioned in this document. Therefore, by issuing this document, the Assembly was effectively seizing power for itself.
In the next year, 1790, on May 19th, the National Assembly abolished the nobility. It abolished both the seigneurial rights of the Second Estate, also known as the nobility, and the tithes gathered by the First Estate, also known as the Catholic clergy. On July 12th, the civil constitution of the French clergy took place. After several months of questioning what they did and wanted their government to look like, the Legislative Assembly was created along with the Constitution on July 12th. In addition to creating a limited monarchy, it also worked to separate the government from the church. On November 27th, the clergy instructed to swear allegiance to France. By spring of 1791, the Catholic Church in France was divided between clerics willing to swear loyalty to the nation and those who remained loyal to Rome. The next year of the French Revolution was 1791. On March 10th of this year, Pope Pius V issued an encyclical condemning the civil constitution and threatening to suspend all clergy who took the oath. The civil constitution became a significant cause of division and disruption in the new society. Then, on June 20th and June 21st, Louis and Marie Antoinette fled the country. They ended up being caught at Varennes. King Louis knew his reign of terror was over. Therefore, the family tried to get out of France by escaping to Austria, but eventually they were caught. Austria wanted France to support their king and became a bit angry when they didn't.
He keeps hoping that people will recognize him and there will be a kind of rebellion in his favor. And much to his horror and surprise, they are not ecstatic to recognize him. They see him as escaping, and basically he's arrested and taken back to Paris.
In September of that year, the new constitution was ratified with the support of King Louis. The next year in this revolution was 1792. On April 20th of this year, France declared war on Austria. The monarchies around Europe weren't happy about the way that France overthrew Louis. However, they weren't going to unite in war either. France didn't need them to declare war. Instead, on April 20th, they declared war themselves on Austria, starting the French Revolutionary Wars. On April 25th, there was the first use of the guillotine. The first execution by the guillotine was performed on highwayman Nicolas Pelletier. The guillotine was used to kill thousands of people during the Reign of Terror. Among them were members of the bourgeoisie, aristocrats, peasants, foreigners, and sympathizers of the revolution. More than 10,000 people lost their heads by guillotine during this revolution, including King Louis and Marie Antoinette. During the French Revolution, the guillotine became the primary symbol of the Reign of Terror. The guillotine was used in France all the way up until the 20th century. However, it was used a lot less during the 1960s and 1970s. Between 1965 and 1977, There were only 8 executions, the last one occurring in 1977. The guillotine was originally developed as a more humane method of execution. It started when Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotin proposed that the French government adopt a gentler method of execution. Even though he was personally opposed to capital punishment, Guillotin argued that decapitating a person by a quick machine would be less painful than a sword and axe beheading. The guillotine executions were huge spectator events in France. People would come and crowd the person being executed and throw roses at him as if this was a moment of joy. Many considered the guillotine operators national celebrities. As the fame of the guillotine grew, the reputation of the operators did as well. Many people asked the same question about the guillotine, whether or not the person would still be conscious for a few seconds after it was cut off. However, no doctor was able to prove that the person was still in a state of consciousness after being decapitated. But in current day, in the 20th century, one doctor has proven that there may still be brain activity in rats after their head is decapitated. The device consists of a tall frame with a weighted and angled blade at the top of it. The person that's being condemned is secured with stocks at the bottom of the frame, positioning the neck below the blade. Then, on June 13th, Prussia declared war on France. In Prussia, a war against France was deemed necessary to arouse German nationalism in those states, in order to allow them to unify most of the German states into a German empire. On August 9th, Paris Commune was established. It was the government of Paris from 1789 to 1795. It was established in Hôtel de Ville just after the storming of the Bastille. It consisted of 144 delegates elected by 6 divisions of the city. On August 10th, the Parisians stormed Tuileries Palace. It's the end of Louis XVI's power. On September 20th, the French cannons drove back to the Parisians at Ville. On September 29th, the French Republic was proclaimed. The last year of the French Revolution was 1793. On January 21st, King Louis XVI was executed. With the Republic's establishment in France, King Louis XVI was brought to court for his crimes. He was executed with a guillotine just like the rest of the nobility. On February 1st, France declared war on Britain and the Netherlands. After the outbreak of the French Revolution in 1789, Britain had remained neutral, watching from the sidelines. But in 1793, when French troops began to occupy the Belgian lands, threatening the Dutch as well as British overland trade through the River Scheldt, the war was instigated. On April 6th, The Committee of Public Safety was founded, the political body of the French Revolution that gained virtual dictatorial control over France during the Reign of Terror. And then on June 24th, the new Constitution was proclaimed. The Constitution that guarantees all Frenchmen equality, liberty, security, property, public debt, freedom of worship, public schooling, public relief, unrestricted freedom of the press, the right to assemble in groups, and the enjoyment of all the rights of man. On August 12th, the mass conscription was instituted. The mass conscription was when all the able-bodied unmarried men between the ages of 18 and 25 were required to enlist. On October 5th, the Republican calendar was adopted. The French Revolutionary calendar was officially adopted in France on this specific day, October 24th. Towards the end of 1793, on October 16th, King Louis XVI's wife, Marie Antoinette, was executed. 9 months after her husband's death, Marie Antoinette was executed with a guillotine as well. In 1794, on July 28th, Robespierre was guillotined. Not surprisingly, France realized that Robespierre wasn't a good guy using fear and hate to kill innocent people. He tried to take over after King Louis XVI was in reign, but unsuccessfully did so. On July 28th, they executed him, ending his reign of terror and marking the end of the French Revolution.
Even centuries prior to the French Revolution, science had begun challenging the old way of thinking, dubbed the Old Order. Galileo discovered craters on the moon's surface, debunking the myth that the moon and other heavenly bodies were perfect spheres. His discovery of the phases of Venus also helped prove that the sun was in the center of the solar system. He published works that supported that our solar system was heliocentric, an idea argued by astronomer Copernicus a few years before, rather than geocentric, which was taught by the Church during this time period. Galileo is also considered to be the founder of the scientific method. Using the scientific method on intellectual concepts birthed the Age of Enlightenment, which eventually became a large factor behind the French Revolution. The Age of Enlightenment was a philosophical movement that began in the 17th century and lasted far into the 18th century. Philosophers such as Locke, Rousseau, and Voltaire were behind this intellectual revolution. The Enlightenment encouraged people to use reason behind their actions rather than biblical thinking. The ideology that knowledge and freedom equate to happiness became popular during this time period. The Old Order became constantly challenged in salons all over France. Salons during the Enlightenment were places where men and women were able to discuss and debate over philosophical and political topics. Support for monarchy and inherited political power in general dwindled during this time period. The idea of the divine right of kings angered the common people. They challenged the ability of God-given right to rule. Kings began to be seen as normal men rather than those specifically gifted by God. This was seen in the abolition of nobility, where nobles lost their titles and lost their special privileges, such as being exempt from taxes. Titles such as Excellency and Your Royal Highness were removed from the French government. The Enlightenment also influenced documents such as the Declaration of the Rights of Man, which was passed in 1789. The Declaration reflects Enlightenment ideas such as natural rights, separation of powers, and basic freedoms such as freedom of speech and assembly. In response to that, 2 years later, Olympe de Gouges wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Women. This declaration advocated for women in politics and stated that women have the same natural rights as their male counterparts. This document was historic as it was one of the first in history to argue for women's rights and equal participation in society. De Gouges' work would inspire Mary Wollstonecraft, a revered women's rights activist most known for writing A Vindication of the Rights of Women in 1792. The French Revolution gave birth to the feminist movement in Europe, as Wollstonecraft is credited for being the mother of British feminism. These type of documents were the first of their kind in Europe, but similar ideas had been implemented in America a few years before. Ideas such as natural rights, separation of powers, and specific freedoms are seen in the American Constitution and its Bill of Rights. The French Revolution was partially inspired by the American Revolution. Sure, there were other factors, such as the financial struggle of the country and the unpopular royals. However, the American Revolution was proof that revolution was possible against strong military power, encouraging the French people. Another revolution happening during this time period also helped change France's ideals. The Haitian Revolution started off as a slave revolt after the government granted French citizenship to landowners. This passage included some free African men while excluding some white men. This caused outrage in the Haitian territory. In 1794, France abolished slavery during this revolution, further showing the Enlightenment idea of freedom. The Industrial Revolution was the change from people hand-making goods to machine manufacturing. This change towards industry led to the ability to mass manufacture goods, and in our particular interest, the mass manufacturing of weapons. This allowed armies to be more standardized, as large numbers were able to be armed with weapons, promoting ground warfare. Soldiers during the French Revolution were given a variety of melee weapons, such as pikes and bayonets. However, their primary firearm was probably the same, being the Model 1777 musket, which was considered superior to its prior creations. The musket was formed with blueprints that were similar to interchangeable parts far before the idea was officially founded by Eli Whitney in 1798. The ammunition used for this musket was more tightly fit into the barrel, which helped increase the accuracy of the weapon. This came at the cost of the fire rate, with French soldiers being able to fire 2 to 3 shots per minute. In comparison, the British Brown Bess was able to fire 3 to 4 shots per minute. This model, while popular during the French Revolution, would not see its production truly rise until the early 1800s. There was a problem with organized labor beforehand, and after Whitney introduced interchangeable parts, factories quickly grasped the concept of the musket. It was the most manufactured firearm until World War I began in the 20th century. Another popular tool during the French Revolution was the guillotine. Its idea fragmented from the work of physician Joseph Ignace Guillotine, who helped pass the law which required that death sentences be carried through a machine. This ties back into the idea of abolition of nobility, as a painless death during this time was refined only to the higher class. Before the guillotine was invented, executions were mostly done by axes. Blunt axes or weak swings would cause unconsciousness while most likely still keeping the victim alive. Another method of execution prior to the invention of the guillotine was the breaking wheel. The sentenced would be tied up to a wheel which would slowly rotate. An iron bar would then be used on the limbs whenever they went over the gaps on the beams of the wheel. This would break bones, but most of the time keep the victim alive for 2 to 3 days. Death was eventually caused by shock and dehydration, rather than their limbs being broken. King Louis XVI and the National Assembly began to understand that a capital punishment should be about administering death as quickly as possible, rather than a painful procedure. The guillotine was built to be sharp, and force was never an issue. The person who was going to be executed is locked into the stocks, called the lunette, at the bottom of the frame of the guillotine. A weighted blade is angled at the top of the frame. It has the ability to move across the grooves of the frame as it is tied to a rope. The executioner lets go of the rope, beheading the sentenced. Scientists estimate that a person would feel pain for around 40 seconds if they were victim to the guillotine. It was originally named the Louisette after inventor Anton Louis, who built the first prototype. The first person to be executed by the guillotine was highwayman Nicolas Jacques Pelletier in 1792 for robbery, murder, and rape. Its usage continued, executing thousands during the French Revolution, notably King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. The last execution by guillotine was in 1977, but it was legally allowed in usage until 1981, when France banned the capital punishment.
Overall, the French Revolution heavily influenced science, driving people's ideologies and providing the tools to rebel.
The French Revolution drastically changed the views and thinking of society, thus substantially affecting literature as well. Literature was the way that many intellects, philosophers, and activists presented their thoughts to the public. A voice of the people, it served as a lethal weapon, beholding the power to further pronounce feelings of oppression
and instigate greater violence. A prominent mark of literature during the French Revolution was Romanticism. This involved idealistic attitudes and sentiments expressed through art and literature instead of realistic ones. During the Great Revolution, Romantic writing could be seen as a mode of escapism and not just expression. It allowed one to not only voice their thoughts and opinions, but also indulge in a world of fantasies of their choice to seek relief from the grotesque violence of the Revolution. The cause of Romantic writing during the French Revolution can essentially be summed up by T.E. Hume, an English poet and philosopher. He said, "Here is the root of all Romanticism, that man, the individual, is an infinite reservoir of possibilities, and if you can so rearrange society by the destruction of oppressive order, then these possibilities will have a chance, and you will get progress." Hume identifies the catalyst. Man is, by nature, a being that seeks an infinite reservoir of possibilities, or in other words, freedom and opportunity to express oneself. However, the restrictions of social hierarchy often make it difficult to do so, especially for those who are oppressed. If this oppressive social order can be dismantled, then people will have the chance to voice their thoughts. This ability to express new ideas will bring to light intellectual concepts and ideologies previously unheard of, leading naturally to the progress of mankind. This was the foundation underlying Romantic writing. The roots of revolution that ignited this change in literature began with the tyrannical dictatorship of the monarch, King Louis XVI. Throughout all of society, there was unjust legislation and division of available resources. Divisions and class differences between nobles and clergymen in comparison to the common working class made it so that certain individuals were more subject to injustice. The working class was often restricted and underrepresented in literature, with only esteemed people of great respect having the ability to publish their works. As people began to demand universal equity during the Revolution, this equity began to be established in literature as well. Individuals began to spread their writing, which often reflected society's tense and restless state of mind. Revolutionary writers who had previously been suppressed now began to gain recognition among others, as new laws provided artists and writers with greater freedom of expressing the emotions they had been waiting to unleash. Ordinary people now learned that they had the power to express themselves, which was a pivotal quality required to maintain the spirit of the Revolution. French lawyer Maximilien Robespierre said, "The secret of freedom lies in educating people, whereas the secret of tyranny lies in keeping them ignorant." Tyranny had been successful until that point because people who opposed it had been silenced. Now that this was lost, the fibers of tyranny began to pull apart, and its once strong framework became weak. Out of people's willingness to now express themselves through literature came the birth of a new philosophy embodying the qualities of Romantic writing. These philosophical ideas were extensively prevailing in poetry specifically. Writing was now centered on values of love and reason, and it focused on sentimental thoughts that conveyed an optimistic hope for the future. Writing now also focused on questioning what were deemed traditional social norms up until that point. Now, writers began to challenge institutions that they had previously conformed to without much thought. Poetry embodied these new and unconventional ideas, heavily influenced by philosophers of that time such as Rousseau, Voltaire, and Turgot. Romantic writing often chased idealistic attitudes that yearned for relief from the bloodshed of the Revolution. Hence, solace in nature became a common theme throughout much of poetry of the time period. As a result, Romantic poetry often exhibited themes, metaphors, and symbols related to nature. Poet William Wordsworth's experience sums up why a multitude of writers turned to nature for comfort. Wordsworth, being intrigued by the ongoing political drama in France, had ventured there with intentions of fighting for the revolution's cause. However, upon witnessing the king's execution, as well as incessant bloodshed throughout the streets of Paris, Wordsworth was left appalled and traumatized. His youthful illusion collapsed, leaving him with bitter misery. His sister Dorothy then introduced him to nature's ability to heal. The philosopher Rousseau also found nature to be a sliver of positivity during such encumbering times. He particularly noticed the tranquility that could be found in, quote, the return to nature, to primitive methods of life, to the reestablishment of human nature and society on elements of love and simple relations among the simple folk. As a result, Rousseau's poetry often focused on a rustic lifestyle and its effect on man, depicting the calm of the revolution rather than the dangerously building storm. A common theme other than Romanticism evident through some French Revolution poets was the concept of disillusionment. Wordsworth specifically wrote about this often, coming from a place of personal experience. This is portrayed in his poem The French Revolution as it appeared to enthusiasts at its commencement. One of the first lines reflects the old perception that Wordsworth, and many others, held at the beginning of the revolution. Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven. This line portrays the youthful but immature light through which the revolution was seen in the beginning, when people were still not aware of the immense tragedy that would result due to it. Wordsworth compares this state of oblivion to heaven, a pure and innocent mindset he knows he cannot regress back to. He highlights the meager, stale, forbidding ways of the custom, law, and statute, which try to deceive people into thinking they are protecting the civil liberties of people, when in reality, this is merely an illusion. Wordsworth then proceeds to refer to the budding rose above the rose full-blown, a symbol of his dependency on nature for consolation from the growing social controversy. He then references to they who had fed their childhood upon dreams, identifying the revolutionaries similar to Wordsworth during the Reign of Terror, who had simply sought to start a political uprising to demand the equity they deserved. However, he acknowledges that these incognizant dreams are an ultimate failure, as the original uprising has now morphed into a gruesome slaughter. Thus, Wordsworth emphasizes people to live not in a utopia or some secreted island heaven knows where, but to live in the very world of all of us. He underscores the importance of the natural and physical world and how he has had to address its realities head-on as the revolution has progressed, rather than continuing to live under a veneer of illusion. Wordsworth then ends his poem by stating that we find our happiness or not at all in this world of realities. He emphasizes first the idea of an individual's sense of happiness by incorporating the pronoun our into his writing, which was not as commonly seen in English literature at the time. He also suggests that perhaps the feigned happiness that comes out of illusionary perceptions of the revolution is not something that will be found, summing up the theme of the poem, which is that the enthusiasm found at the commencement of the French Revolution was not long-lasting. Literature during the French Revolution also saw a significant change due to the increased prevalence of women authors. The norms of the past before revolution saw women fulfilling the typical role that one expected during that time period. Household duties and familial obligations were the epitome of a woman's life. Her public life was restricted to the confines of her husband's domain rather than a life of her own. However, as the concept of universal equality triggered the suppressed to gather the courage to have a voice of their own, women of all backgrounds became enchanted by this idea, this possibility, this new-founded freedom. Now, women could finally have the liberation to express the struggles and opinions they had yearned to share for so long. A renowned feminist writer was Mary Wollstonecraft, who lived from 1759 to 1797. She was born to a father who was a domestic tyrant and grew up to make her way in the world independently. She soon became an established and respected member of London's rationalist intellects. She argued that the power of reason of the mind does not differ between men and women. Both are equally competent. She proceeded to write many feminist argumentative pieces, such as A Vindication on the Rights of Men. Later on in life, she wrote novels such as Frankenstein as well. Another acclaimed feminist author of that time period was Madame Roland, who lived from 1754 to 1793. However, she differed from Wollstonecraft in the fact that she did not explicitly advocate for female rights in her works, but she still propagated female prominence across the globe through her own influence. In her writing, she emphasized the importance of allowing women an education, declaring that they would be equally as competent as men if they were educated. Aside from her literature, she also hosted political gatherings with congregations of Brissotins, a political faction that was accepting of women in their discussions as well. Most of her works were not completed during her lifetime and were finished and published by someone else posthumously following her death. Olympe de Gouges was another woman writer who lived from 1748 to 1793. In her works, she challenged the conventional roles of male dominance in society, demanding male-female equity. She was closely associated with the Girondins, a political faction group that emerged with the basis of criticizing the court and supporting foreign war as a means of uniting people under the singular cause of revolution. However, her ties with this faction, along with her rather provocative literature, was seen as a threat to society, and so she was executed by the guillotine. Overall, literature played an imperative role in fueling the fire of the revolution. It ultimately allowed people to express themselves in a way they were previously unfamiliar with.
The French Revolution was a crucial and climactic time period of European history, as it drastically altered the underlying social hierarchy and relationship between rulers and the general public. Revolution and revolt of the people resulted in radical social and political change that was previously unheard of. The transformation of society was heavily influenced by science, literature, and philosophy of the time. Ultimately, the French Revolution paved the way for modern history and a more progressive ideology of thought.